How are you today, I ask? Because what you're about to hear isn't just another story about a plane crash. It's a reminder that sometimes doing nothing is the worst thing you can do. 62 people boarded a modern aircraft thinking it was just another late-night flight. A veteran captain, a capable co-pilot, a trusted airline, clear instructions from air traffic control. Everything looked normal, but hours later, all that remained was a crater of fire and twisted steel in southern Russia. And the reason? It wasn't the storm. It wasn't the jet. It was the mind of the man holding the yoke and the silence of the one beside him. This is the story of Flydubai 981, a flight that didn't crash because of bad weather, but because of a bad decision. And behind that decision was a deadly mix of pride, fatigue, and a moment no one dared to interrupt. So the question I ask isn't what went wrong. The question is, what would you have done if you were there? Let's begin. Captain Aristos Socrates had over 6,000 hours of flight time in the respect of his peers. But on the night of March 18, 2016, the weight of fatigue and expectation would cloud his judgment. As Flight 981 lifted off from Dubai, bound for Rostov on Don, Russia, it seemed routine. The aircraft was a Boeing 737-800, one of the most reliable models in commercial aviation. The weather was forecasted to be unstable but manageable, and the crew had the fuel to hold if necessary. It was a late-night flight carrying 62 souls, including 44 Russian citizens returning from holidays, 8 Ukrainians and several others from India and Uzbekistan. They were supposed to land by 1:20 a.m. local time, but as they approached the airspace over Rostov, the conditions on the ground began to deteriorate. Wind gusts reached 72 kilometers per hour, and reports of potential wind shear started to appear. 2 aircraft had managed to land earlier, but after that, no others had succeeded. Visibility dropped. The wind turned erratic and the runway remained soaked in rain. The captain chose to attempt a landing anyway. As they descended, the aircraft systems detected wind shear and alarms began to sound. Immediately, Socrates executed a textbook. Go around climbing the plane back into safe airspace and stabilizing at 8,000 feet. It was the right call, a calm, measured reaction under pressure. But what came next turned a moment of skill into a spiral of overconfidence. They entered a holding pattern, circling above the airport for over an hour, waiting for a break in the weather. The fuel load allowed them time, but time does not always bring clarity. As the minutes passed, fatigue set in. The human body hits its lowest point between 2 and 4 a.m., and both pilots were already operating under extended hours. Socrates was nearing the end of his contract and had spoken to colleagues about switching airlines. He had a child on the way, and this was supposed to be his last flight. He may have wanted to end on a strong note, or simply avoid the logistical and financial costs of a diversion. Whatever the reason, he chose to wait. While other aircrafts diverted elsewhere, he kept circling. First Officer Alejandro Alava suggested options, asked questions, but stopped short of challenging the decision directly. Sometimes it's not the storm that kills you. It's the need to prove you can survive it, and the silence of those who could have said otherwise. At around 2:30 a.m., another aircraft attempted to land and failed, reporting dangerous wind shear again. Still, Flight 981 remained at holding, waiting for a moment that would never come. Controllers on the ground reported no current wind shear, not because it was safe, but because no one else was landing. The statement was misinterpreted. The weather had not improved, it had only become more deceptive. By 3:00 a.m., the crew decided to try again. Socrates initiated the second approach, lining up with runway 22. They descended steadily through clouds and turbulence, the airport below, still slick with rain, the wind howling past the fuselage. As they neared 100 feet, a sudden gust struck the aircraft, increasing its airspeed dramatically. The crew responded by initiating a second go-around, but this time something was off. The aircraft pitched up aggressively, too aggressively. The flaps and trim were not properly set, and the climb angle became dangerously steep. Socrates pushed forward on the control column, trying to reduce the nose angle. But in doing so, he fought against the aircraft's stabilizer system, which had already trimmed for nose up. The result was a mechanical conflict, one that destabilized the aircraft further. Instead of gently correcting, he toggled the electric trim switches aggressively, commanding a sharp nose, down input. The plane surged forward momentarily, the system struggling to comply. They were climbing rapidly, and then abruptly, the plane began to dive downward. In moments of crisis, your hands remember what your brain forgets, but only if those instincts were trained and tested and rested. These were not the conditions inside Flight 981. In those final seconds, the cockpit turned chaotic. Overspeed warnings, stall alerts, and terrain alarms blared simultaneously. Alava attempted to pull back on the control column, trying to regain pitch, but the configuration was lost. The aircraft was falling fast with little time to recover. Socrates continued to adjust trim erratically, and at one point banked the aircraft left by 16 degrees, despite no procedural reason to do so. His actions reflected confusion, disorientation, the kind that comes when perception collapses under stress. At 3:42 a.m., the Boeing 737 hit the ground, nose first at over 600 kilometers per hour. The impact destroyed the aircraft, instantly turning it into a fireball that lit the airport grounds and surrounding fields. The crater left behind was a brutal marker of how far a single decision could reach. News of the crash reached headquarters within minutes, but there was no hope of survivors. Emergency crews arrived to a scene that could only be described as unrecognizable. The aircraft had disintegrated on impact, and debris was scattered across a wide radius. The fuselage was gone, the cockpit obliterated, and personal belongings lay charred among torn metal. The investigators were stunned, not just by the violence of the crash, but by what they did not find. There were no signs of engine failure, no catastrophic structural break, no act of terrorism. Every system had worked as designed except the humans who controlled it. The black box recordings revealed the chaos of the final seconds, but more importantly, they exposed the silence before the storm. Both pilots had chances to call off the approach. Both had opportunities to speak up, to reset, to divert, but those chances passed and were never taken. What killed Flight 981 was not the wind or the rain, but the psychology of command and the paralyzing effect of hierarchy and fatigue. It's easy to assume that professionals with thousands of hours would never falter, but even the most experienced minds can drift when stress and exhaustion take over. Socrates was not a bad pilot, but in that moment he was a tired man, flying into a worsening situation with no one willing to say, "Stop." As for Alava, he was technically capable, but socially restrained. His role as co-pilot made him hesitate, and that hesitation cost lives. There are moments in life when the price of silence is everything. This was one of them. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is interrupt the person you respect most in the world, especially when lives depend on it. During the investigation, both the airline and authorities tried to balance technical analysis with human factors, but the conclusion was clear. This was a textbook example of controlled flight into terrain, resulting from misjudgment and poor crew resource management, a term used when two pilots fail to collaborate, challenge or support one another. Effectively, CRM training exists for this exact reason, to empower the second in command to speak up. But training alone is not always enough. Culture plays a role. Personality plays a role. Fatigue plays a role. And in this case, all three aligned in the worst way possible. The report listed the probable cause as pilot error due to spatial disorientation and poor decision-making under stress. But buried within the appendices were hints of something more universal. This was a story of two people. One who believed he had to finish what he started, and another who thought staying quiet was safer than being wrong. As the details emerged, public scrutiny grew. Why didn't they divert? Why didn't the co-pilot high control? Why did they try again when no one else dared? The questions were many, but the answer was always the same. Because they were human. Because even inside the safest technology ever built, we still bring our flaws and fears and instincts aboard. The legacy of Flight 981 is not just a cautionary tale for pilots. It's a lesson for anyone who's ever sat silently in a room and felt that something was off and chose to say nothing. It's for anyone who's ever felt a growing unease and hoped someone else would act first. In aviation, as in life, hesitation kills. Not always instantly, but inevitably. The final moments of that flight are chilling because of how fast everything collapsed. 1 second they were climbing, the next they were diving. And before a single full sentence could be spoken, they were gone. Alava's last word was a startled call out. Socrates never responded. The descent rate was too fast, the altitude too low, the time too short to fix what had already broken. It wasn't a lack of skill that doomed them. It was a lack of intervention at the moment when it was hardest to speak. As the aviation world studied the crash and implemented reminders into future training programs, the families of the victims were left with something that couldn't be recorded or analyzed. Silence. What they lost was not just loved ones, but the belief that expertise always guarantees safety. It does not. What guarantees safety is honesty, challenge, and the courage to speak truth even when it shakes the cockpit walls. In the days that followed, the crash site became a place of mourning. Not only for the families of the victims, but for a nation grappling with the suddenness of a loss that felt avoidable. Journalists arrived, footage was replayed, and theories flooded forums and news outlets. Most pointed fingers at the airline, some at the regulators, and many at the pilots themselves. But among the noise, a quieter question lingered. Why had no one said, "Stop"? Behind the technical jargon and investigative findings was a deeply human story about communication, leadership, and the razor-thin margin for error that exists in modern aviation. The cockpit is a sacred space of coordination and mutual responsibility, and yet in moments of pressure, that shared responsibility can fracture without a single raised voice. This is not exclusive to aviation. It happens in hospitals, on construction sites, inside operating rooms, and at boardroom tables. Spaces where one person holds the authority and others hold their breath. The idea of cockpit gradient. The psychological distance between captain and co-pilot is not just a theory, it is a measurable force. When that distance is too great, truth gets delayed and hesitation takes the place of action. Alava wasn't just quiet because of hierarchy. He was quiet because our systems have conditioned people to prioritize harmony over confrontation, even when lives are on the line. If you've ever sat in a meeting and said nothing, even though you knew something was off, you've lived a fragment of what happened inside Flight 981. In response to the crash, Flydubai reviewed its crew, resource management training, restructured its fatigue policies, and strengthened guidance on diversion procedures. But none of those changes could reverse what had happened. Families gathered pieces of their loved ones from the debris field, while legal teams argued over liability. Compensation was issued, Apologies made, and still the damage echoed far beyond the moment of impact. Air travel remains the safest mode of transportation, but that safety relies on something more fragile than metal or software. It relies on people being honest when it matters most. The captain did not intend to crash. The co-pilot did not intend to be passive. But intention means little when perception is blurred and decisions unfold under the weight of pride and pressure. There's a critical point in every high-stakes scenario where you either speak or you don't, and if you miss that point, it does not return. It is not always obvious. It is not always fair, but it is always final. Some argued afterward that Socrates should never have flown that night, that he was too tired, too distracted, too close to the end of his career. Others said Alava should have taken over the controls, or at least demanded they divert. But hindsight is clean, and decisions are not made in clarity. They are made in noise, in doubt, in fatigue, and in fear of consequence. The truth is, they both knew something was wrong, but knowing and acting are not the same. The flight data showed a crew under stress, reacting rather than leading, interpreting signals through the fog of exhaustion. The second go-around was initiated without the full stability of the aircraft, and the trim system was overridden in a way that introduced chaos into a process that required calm. In aviation, control is everything, and when that control is split, one move can either restore balance or end it. Flight 981's final dive lasted only seconds, but the decisions that led there were built over hours. Circling, hoping, waiting, and finally reacting too late. If there is one thing to remember from this story, it is not just that two trained men made a mistake. It is that everyone around them assumed they would not. Systems failed, not because they broke, but because they were trusted too much to fail. Sometimes you don't need a storm to bring down a plane. You only need a pause that lasts too long. The descent of Flight 981 is now part of aviation history, but the questions it leaves behind stretch far beyond the skies. What would you do if you were the only voice left to stop something? Would you speak? Would you act? Or would you wait? Just one more second and find out that second was the last months after the crash. Investigators continue piecing together timelines, listening again and again to cockpit recordings, trying to find the exact second everything unraveled. But they always came back to the same realization. It wasn't a sudden technical fault or a violent atmospheric twist that doomed the flight. It was a buildup of moments, subtle cues, and ignored instincts. Some accidents come like lightning, but this one came like fog creeping in, slowly surrounding everything and finally leaving no way out. In an internal memo leaked months later, one training officer admitted that even he would have struggled to challenge a senior captain under those conditions. That memo sparked a quiet shift in the industry. CRM courses were restructured, and mental health was finally given space in discussions about cockpit behavior. But reforms born from tragedy always arrive too late for the ones who needed them most. At one memorial, a young woman clutched a photo of her parents, both passengers aboard Flight 981, their bodies recovered days apart. She said nothing to the cameras, only stared into the distance as if waiting for an arrival that would never happen. For her and for dozens of others, this story was not a case study. It was a fracture in time. It was an ordinary night that became the dividing line between before and after. And that is perhaps what makes this crash linger so powerfully. It didn't happen because of war or sabotage or mechanical failure. It happened because two people with all the training in the world could not cut through the fog inside their own minds. The question the aviation world was left with wasn't just how to fix systems. It was how to recognize the moments when confidence becomes blindness and when respect becomes silence. Socrates likely thought he was doing the right thing. He likely believed that one more try, one more descent would bring everyone home. But as one investigator put it, sometimes the belief that you are still in control is the very thing that proves you've already lost it. That belief unchecked can be as lethal as any structural fault. The systems didn't break, but the bridge between two pilots did. When planes fall from the sky, we want a villain. We want a singular fault we can isolate and correct. But some stories refuse to cooperate. They point instead to culture, to psychology, to the thousands of tiny decisions made in hours of gray uncertainty. That's harder to solve and harder to forget. That night, above a Russian runway, two men faced the question that haunts every cockpit. What do you do when you're no longer sure you should continue? The answer for them was silence, and in that silence, 62 lives were lost. The final descent lasted only a few seconds, but the echoes of that fall now live in flight simulators, training briefings, safety seminars, and in the memories of families that will never fully heal. There's no comfort in the black box's data. There's only clarity and the weight of knowing what could have been. Some of the pilots who reviewed the transcripts later admitted that they had been in similar situations themselves. Close calls, gut instincts. Times they almost didn't speak up. That is the real horror of Flight 981. Not just that it happened, but that it came so close to happening so many times before, and perhaps without change could happen again. For the passengers, there was no warning, no clue that anything was wrong. They were strapped in, preparing to land, likely watching the cabin lights flicker against the storm outside. And then nothing. Just the roar, the pull, and the end. If there is a lesson here, it isn't written in red ink or found only in manuals. It's whispered in doubt, in hesitation, in those quiet internal alarms we sometimes ignore. Speak when you feel it. Act when you sense it. And if someone else hesitates, be the voice that breaks the silence. It's easy to say in hindsight. It's harder to do in the moment, but the sky has no sympathy for those who choose to wait. It only has consequences. And Flight 981 paid them in full. There's a moment after every tragedy when the noise fades, when the headlines grow quiet, and the wreckage becomes statistics. But some stories refuse to settle. Flight 981 is not just a cautionary tale told in classrooms or printed in final reports. It is a mirror held up to the fragility of human judgment and the danger of assuming that silence means agreement. For many of the families, the years that followed were filled not just with grief, but with a gnawing sense that it should not have happened. The plane worked. The alerts worked. The procedures were in place. But still it fell. And what was left behind was not just ash and metal, but the echo of what was not said. The sky that night over Rostov on dawn was not kind, but it was not unforgiving either. It offered 2 chances, 2 go-arounds, 2 exits, and still the fatal decision was made. What haunts those who study this case is not just the steep descent or the stall warnings. It's the fact that in those last minutes, no one broke the pattern. No one reached for the emergency brake. No one said the one word that could have changed the course. Divert. The lesson then is not dramatic. It is quiet, and that is precisely why it matters. You do not need to be a pilot to carry this story with you, because every one of us has a cockpit, a space where we are either in control or watching someone else steer toward danger. And every one of us has a voice, one that can warn, one that can interrupt, one that can save. It may not always feel powerful, it may not always be heard, but when it is used at the right moment, it can be the difference between falling and flying. Flight 981 is now part of aviation history, but it is also part of something much deeper. It is a story about fatigue, about hierarchy, about misplaced confidence and misread silence. But above all, it is about the cost of not asking one more time. Are you sure this is the right thing to do? So as we leave this chapter behind, remember this. Sometimes disasters don't begin with explosions. They begin with quiet decisions made alone, unchecked, and uninterrupted. And if there is one legacy to honor the lives lost on that flight, it is not just safer skies. It is braver voices.